The night Buckingham Palace went silent, the corridors carried whispers colder than the marble floors beneath the Queen's portrait. It wasn't grief this time. It was disgrace. The kind of quiet that follows when a royal name is about to be erased, not by death, but by shame. And this time, it wasn't some minor duke in a far-off estate. It was the king's own brother. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if I told you that King Charles, a man raised on the idea that family is forever, has finally done the unthinkable, exiling Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson from the United Kingdom? Yes, exile. The word sounds medieval, but the circumstances couldn't be more modern. Criminal investigations, charity scandals, secret files, and an enraged monarch determined to protect the crown, even if it means destroying his brother's life. But let's rewind a little, because this didn't happen overnight. It wasn't one scandal, one photo, or one newspaper headline. It was years of rot, years of whispers that were politely ignored at royal dinners, years of Sarah's business ventures that always seemed to end with missing money and awkward apologies, years of Andrew pretending to serve honorably while the palace quietly paid settlements and bought silence. The royal family had survived wars, divorces, and Diana's tragic death, but this was different. This wasn't gossip. It was criminal. And it all began with a letter King Charles received from London's Metropolitan Police. A letter that would change everything. Because according to high-level insiders, the letter didn't just contain an update, it contained an ultimatum. Scotland Yard had reopened files concerning the Duke of York, citing new corroborative testimonies and potential evidence of misconduct in public office. The tone wasn't polite. It was formal, forceful, and clear. "Your Majesty," it began, "you will be informed before charges are made." Charges? Against a royal. Against his brother. Imagine sitting in the gilded drawing room of Buckingham Palace, reading that sentence, realizing that your family's scandals aren't just embarrassing anymore, they're radioactive. For King Charles, it was the moment the monarchy's fragile wall of discretion finally cracked. But here's where it gets darker. That same week, whispers began swirling around Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, about financial discrepancies in her charity accounts. Funds missing, donors complaining, a pattern of transactions that suggested money had been diverted into personal ventures. On paper, it looked like mismanagement. Behind the scenes, it looked like fraud. So here we have it. A king trying to modernize a centuries-old monarchy, and two disgraced ex-royals dragging his name through the mud. Can you imagine the fury? The betrayal? Reports say that Charles's temper, normally restrained behind polished etiquette, erupted in private. "He has humiliated us all," he was overheard saying to a close aide. "He has turned our family name into a joke." But the humiliation was just the beginning. Because once the police files reached palace hands, the king's legal team uncovered something much worse: a record of meetings, phone logs, and foreign accounts that suggested Andrew's entanglements ran deeper than anyone had imagined. He wasn't just guilty of bad judgment. He might have been complicit in corruption. And Sarah? She wasn't the bystander she claimed to be. For years, Sarah Ferguson had reinvented herself as the friendly ex, the one who still attended royal events, the warm-hearted duchess who called the queen mummy. But that image started to crumble the moment investigators found her name linked to several questionable wire transfers connected to her children's foundation. Charity work, she said in interviews. Business partnerships, she corrected later. But investigators called them suspicious movements of funds. The optics were catastrophic. Two disgraced figures, both connected by name, blood, and scandal, threatening to stain a monarchy already fighting for modern legitimacy. And this time, there would be no quiet settlement, no friendly press release. King Charles had had enough. He called his advisors to a meeting at Clarence House. The agenda? What to do with Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. One courtier described the mood as grim, funereal even. No laughter, no polite chatter, just the sound of paper shuffling, the weight of centuries pressing down on one table. Charles listened, stone-faced, as his chief advisor laid out the options. Option 1. Strip all royal patronages and quietly isolate Andrew and Sarah from public life. Option 2. Cut off financial support and disavow them publicly. Option 3. Exile. The word hung in the air like smoke. Exile, Charles repeated, his voice low, almost uncertain. From the United Kingdom? Yes, Your Majesty. They cannot be allowed to reside on royal estates or attend any official functions. Their presence in this country is untenable. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. But here's where things get truly shocking. Because before Charles could act, before the world could learn what was happening behind palace walls, something unexpected happened. A leak. An anonymous email reached a London tabloid hinting that King Charles is preparing to exile his brother. The press didn't believe it at first. It sounded too extreme, too medieval. But then came a follow-up. Both Andrew and Sarah Ferguson are subjects of active investigations. Within hours, social media lit up. Royal exile trended across Europe. The shame of the Windsors screamed across the front page of the Daily Mail. The palace's phones rang nonstop. Public relations scrambled to issue a statement, but Charles refused. "We say nothing," he ordered. "Not until they're gone." Meanwhile, Andrew and Sarah reportedly fled Windsor for Balmoral, seeking privacy and protection. But Balmoral was no longer a refuge. It was the site of their last royal privilege. And soon, even that would be taken away. The irony? Sarah had always said that the royal family never abandons their own. But that's exactly what was about to happen. Behind the scenes, the king's team began preparing a private document titled Exile Orders, House of York. It outlined, in cold bureaucratic language, the procedures for removing their access to royal residences, travel privileges, and funding. Their names would be quietly erased from the royal registry of active members. Their staff dismissed. Their security withdrawn. You might think this is overkill. You might wonder, isn't that too harsh? But to understand Charles's reasoning, you need to remember something. He's the monarch who lived his entire life under scandal. He saw what public shame did to his mother during Diana's years. He saw how his own affair with Camilla nearly destroyed the monarchy. He knows how one story can undo generations of legacy. So when it came to Andrew, this wasn't about punishment, it was about survival. Still, there was one problem: the Queen's legacy. Queen Elizabeth had famously protected Andrew, shielding him from public fallout as long as she lived. Mummy's favorite, the press called him. She funded his lifestyle, gave him refuge, and refused to strip his titles completely. But with her gone, that shield vanished. Now, the new king faced the same choice his mother refused to make. And according to insiders, he made it without hesitation. His Majesty has resolved that the Duke of York and Ms. Ferguson shall permanently reside abroad and refrain from any public duties or royal engagements. Read the final draft of the exile order. It was signed in ink and sealed with the royal crest. But before it could be delivered, another twist emerged, one that made the situation far more explosive. Sarah Ferguson, unaware of the exile order, was preparing to appear on a major British talk show to discuss her latest charity project. Her publicist thought it was an image-saving move. The palace saw it as provocation. "She's taunting us," one courtier told the press. Acting as if nothing happened, King Charles was livid. He reportedly phoned his chief of communications personally. "Stop that broadcast," he said. "I don't care how." But it was too late. The interview aired. Sarah smiled, joked about her colorful past, and brushed off financial allegations as just misunderstandings. The clip went viral within hours, and not in a good way. The comments were brutal. "Scammer Duchess. Fergie the fraud. She should be in jail, not on TV." For Charles, it was the final insult. That night, royal aides were seen leaving Buckingham with sealed envelopes marked confidential. One was addressed to the Home Office, another to Scotland Yard, and one, hand-delivered, to Prince Andrew himself. The letter inside contained 5 short sentences. "Andrew, by command of His Majesty the King, you are hereby instructed to vacate royal premises within 7 days. Your presence in the United Kingdom is no longer deemed appropriate. Further instructions will follow." The crown. No signature. No kindness. Just the full weight of royal authority. Imagine reading that from your own brother, the man you once stood beside at your mother's funeral, the man who swore to protect the family name. Now he was erasing you from it. Andrew reportedly shouted, cursed, and smashed a glass in anger. Sarah wept, insisting he wouldn't do this to me. But he did. The very next morning, palace vehicles arrived at Royal Lodge. Curtains drawn. Security guards replaced. And for the first time in his life, Prince Andrew found himself on the outside of royal privilege, literally and figuratively. The story hit the tabloids like a thunderclap. Exiled, screamed the Sun, King Charles banishes brother in royal scandal. For days, reporters camped outside the gates, hoping for a glimpse of the disgraced Duke and Duchess as they prepared to leave. But no one saw them leave. Some say they fled to Switzerland. Others claim they've relocated to Portugal under private protection. The truth? Only the king and his closest advisors know for sure. What's certain is this: King Charles didn't just exile his brother. He set a new precedent, a monarchy that no longer hides its sins but casts them out. And yet, something about it feels unfinished. Because while Andrew and Sarah are gone, the investigations haven't stopped. Scotland Yard still has files open. The charity audits continue. And there's talk, quiet, cautious talk, of other names appearing in those same documents. Could it be that exile was just the first step? Because what's coming next might shake Buckingham Palace to its foundations. And no one, least of all King Charles, is ready for what's about to be revealed. What does it take for a king to finally turn on his own blood? Not gossip, not embarrassment, not even public humiliation. No, it takes something far colder, betrayal wrapped in lies and sealed with official documents marked confidential. That was the breaking point. King Charles had spent a lifetime cleaning up royal messes, his own, his family's, his ancestors'. But this time, the stain wasn't just on reputation. It was on the law. And when the law knocks at the palace gates, not even the crown can keep it out. It started, as most catastrophes do, on a quiet morning that should have been unremarkable. A bright London sun, birds over the gardens of Clarence House, and the king in his study reviewing briefing papers. The letter arrived with no ceremony, no red ribbon, no gold crest. Just a plain brown envelope with Scotland Yard's insignia stamped at the corner. But inside it lay the spark that would ignite a royal firestorm. The contents were short, clinical, and devastating. The Metropolitan Police were recommending charges against Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Public misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and potential obstruction of justice. Words that cut like ice. There was no softness, no hint of Your Majesty, with respect. It was pure authority, the law addressing the crown as an equal. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. He simply stared at the paper, the weight of centuries pressing down on his chest. The image of his mother, the late queen, flashed in his mind. How she had protected Andrew until her last breath, refusing to believe her favorite son could ever truly fall. But Charles wasn't his mother. He had inherited her crown, not her sentimentality. He whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, "It's come to this." The private secretary, hovering nearby, dared to ask, "Your Majesty, shall I summon the legal counsel?" "No," Charles said quietly. "Summon the family." By nightfall, the drawing room was full. Camilla sat stiff-backed, her expression unreadable. Prince William stood by the window, arms folded. Princess Anne looked tired, as if she'd seen this storm coming for months. On a side table lay the letter, the silent intruder in the room. Charles began slowly, his voice controlled but trembling at the edges. "You all know why we're here. Scotland Yard has recommended formal charges against Andrew." The silence that followed was suffocating. William broke it first. "So they've finally done it." His tone wasn't surprised, just grimly accepting. It was only a matter of time. Camilla frowned. "This will destroy what's left of our credibility. The public won't forgive another scandal." Charles's jaw tightened. "The public won't forgive me if I ignore it." And spoke next, softly but firmly. "We all know what Mother would have done. But you're not her. You can't afford to protect him." The king nodded. Precisely. There it was. The moment when family ties gave way to royal duty. The beginning of exile. But here's the cruel twist. Even as they discussed Andrew's fate, the Duke himself was blissfully unaware of the full extent of what was coming. At Royal Lodge, Andrew was pacing, furious at the headlines, convinced it was all a misunderstanding. "They can't charge me," he told Sarah. "It's a witch hunt." Charles wouldn't allow it. Sarah, ever the optimist, or perhaps the delusional partner in crime, smiled thinly. "He's your brother. He'll protect you. He always does. But not this time." Back at Clarence House, Charles turned to his advisors. "How strong is the case?" The chief legal aide cleared his throat. "Strong enough, sir. There are multiple corroborations, including financial records. And, well, there's video evidence. Video. The word hit like a hammer. Charles leaned forward. What kind of video? Footage from several years ago, taken in New York. It corroborates certain statements made in sworn testimony. Camilla's teacup clinked against the saucer. William's head snapped around and looked away, muttering something about the final disgrace. The aide continued, Your Majesty, there's also concern about obstruction. Someone within Andrew's circle attempted to interfere with a witness. Charles's voice dropped. Who? Unconfirmed. But we believe it could be Sarah Ferguson. The air in the room changed instantly. You could feel the shift, shock, then anger, then resignation. Charles exhaled through his nose, steady but livid. Then they both must go. A long pause. William asked quietly, Go where? Anywhere but here. It was that simple. A king's judgment. No trial. No debate. The monarchy's version of exile. But the build-up didn't end there. Within days, the press exploded. Someone, perhaps from inside the palace, had leaked the news that the king was considering severe disciplinary measures against the Duke of York. Reporters descended on Windsor. Photographers camped outside Sarah's residence. And every front page in Britain screamed the same question. Will King Charles finally cut off his brother? Inside Buckingham Palace, Charles was livid. Who leaked this? He demanded. No one answered. Perhaps because everyone knew the truth, it didn't matter anymore. The public already sensed blood. Meanwhile, Andrew's desperation turned to denial. He began calling old friends in the military, hoping for support. He called lawyers, trying to delay charges. He even attempted to contact journalists to set the record straight. But every call ended the same way, silence or rejection. No one wanted to touch the Duke of York anymore. And through it all, Sarah Ferguson kept smiling for the cameras, pretending nothing was wrong. She posted cheerful updates about charity work and empowerment, even as investigators were tracing her financial transactions. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The build-up reached its peak one stormy evening when Charles received an unmarked USB drive. No note, no sender, just a memory stick left in an envelope marked for your eyes only. He plugged it into his laptop. On the screen appeared a series of documents, followed by a grainy video, time-stamped, authenticated, and impossible to deny. What he saw made his stomach turn. It wasn't violence or crime in the usual sense. It was moral decay. Andrew, laughing with known associates, discussing arrangements, completely unaware he was being recorded. Charles shut the laptop. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he called his aide and said, Prepare the order. The Duke of York is to be removed from royal residence immediately. That was the moment the king stopped being a brother and became a monarch. The following day, he summoned Andrew privately to Buckingham Palace. Eyewitnesses described the meeting as tense beyond belief. Andrew stormed in, his face red, voice raised. You can't do this to me. I've done nothing wrong. Charles remained seated, eyes cold. You've done everything wrong. You're my brother. I'm your king. The silence after that line was heavier than any insult. Andrew sputtered, tried to argue, but Charles simply handed him a sealed envelope, the same kind that had been delivered days earlier. You will leave quietly. If you love this family at all, you'll do it with dignity. Andrew tore the envelope open, scanned the document, and his expression crumpled. Exile? You want me gone? Charles didn't flinch. It's already done. For a moment, Andrew just stared, then muttered. You think this will save you? You think they'll stop digging once I'm gone? Charles stood, turned his back, and said, I'm not doing this to save myself. I'm doing it to save the crown. He left the room without another word. Outside, rain lashed against the palace windows. Inside, the king's decision rippled through every corridor. Servants whispered, guards exchanged looks, and aides began shredding old correspondence connected to the Duke. By midnight, an official memo was drafted. Effective immediately, His Royal Highness Prince Andrew, Duke of York, is relieved of all remaining royal duties and privileges. The royal website was quietly updated at dawn. His biography vanished. His patronages were listed as vacant. But while Charles was cleaning house, Sarah Ferguson was busy staging her own counterattack. She contacted friends in the media, claiming the king's advisors were out to destroy her family. She even hinted at writing a tell-all memoir, one that would expose royal hypocrisy. Dangerous words. Because in Buckingham Palace, secrets are currency, and Sarah was threatening to spend it all. The king's advisors panicked. If she talks, she'll drag the entire institution through the mud, one warned. Charles, surprisingly calm, replied, "Then perhaps it's time the mud saw some sunlight." He wasn't bluffing. Within 48 hours, the palace issued a quiet instruction to the British Home Office to review the residency and visa status of both Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. The machinery of exile had begun. The press didn't get wind of it until days later, but by then, the damage was already done. Andrew's security detail was reduced. Access to private jets was revoked. Credit lines tied to royal accounts were frozen. Even their staff, drivers, assistants, gardeners, were reassigned elsewhere. Imagine it. 1 week you're living in a 30-room mansion with taxpayer-funded security. The next, you're told your keys don't work. That's how fast the crown moves when it decides you're expendable. But if Charles thought this would end the scandal, he was wrong. Because exile wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a bigger reckoning. Behind the scenes, investigators were uncovering something neither Andrew nor Sarah expected: cross-linked accounts, shared trusts, and evidence of cooperation in diverting funds. It wasn't just two parallel scandals, it was one tangled web. And at the center of it was a name that shocked even the king. One of their supposed anonymous donors was a foreign businessman with deep political ties. His financial contributions linked directly to overseas shell companies, companies already under scrutiny for corruption. That's when Charles realized this wasn't just about family anymore. This was about the monarchy being used as a cover for dirty money. He called his private secretary at once. "I want every document, every record connected to Andrew and Sarah. I want to know who they met, where the money came from, and who else was involved." The secretary hesitated. "Your Majesty, that could expose others." "I don't care." And with that, the king crossed a line few monarchs ever dare to cross. He opened an investigation into his own family. That was the true breaking point. Not the exile order, not the scandal, the decision to shine a light inward. Because in a family built on silence, truth is the one thing they fear most. But what Charles didn't know, what no one in that room suspected, was that someone was already one step ahead. Someone inside the palace had been quietly copying files, recording calls, and preparing to leak the next big revelation. And when that leak hit the press, it wouldn't just implicate Andrew and Sarah. It would lead straight to the king himself. What do you do when a scandal refuses to die? When the whispers, the headlines, the damning photographs, and incriminating documents keep resurfacing no matter how carefully you try to sweep them under the velvet carpets of royalty. That was the situation facing Prince Andrew. And make no mistake, the Duke of York's past was a wildfire, and every attempt to contain it only made it roar louder. Even before King Charles issued the exile order, Andrew's name had been toxic for decades. The stories about Epstein had already left permanent scars on the monarchy. Public perception had shifted from mere curiosity to outright condemnation. Andrew had once been a prince, a symbol of duty and charm. Now, he was a cautionary tale, an emblem of arrogance, entitlement, and moral failure. It started innocently enough, or as innocently as a royal's life can ever seem. Andrew was a young man of privilege, a son of the Queen, entrusted with public service and the responsibilities of one of the highest-ranking members of the royal family. But fame, money, and connections can be a dangerous cocktail. Allegations began to surface, some whispered, some reported, some too disturbing to repeat in polite company. Yet for Andrew, none of it mattered. He kept attending events, smiling for cameras, shaking hands with dignitaries, while rumors of impropriety swirled around him like a persistent storm. And the public noticed. They remembered the photo op with Epstein. They remembered the ill-timed jokes, the arrogance that seemed to drip from every public appearance. And in every instance, the monarchy's silence was interpreted as complicity. But here's the contradiction. Inside Buckingham Palace, Andrew was considered a family liability, but a family member nonetheless. For years, Queen Elizabeth had shielded him from scrutiny. She granted him a buffer of protection, paying off legal settlements quietly, using discretion to keep public outrage from spilling too far. Andrew relied on this protection, assuming it would never end. That buffer was the illusion that kept him blind to the reality of his actions. And then came the documents, leaks, audits, court testimonies, and surveillance. Each one was a needle in his already fragile armor. The public learned more details about his business associations, offshore accounts, and unexplained trips abroad. Each revelation painted him in a worse light, and with each, the narrative shifted. Andrew wasn't just careless. He was manipulative, cunning, and aware of the risks, yet undeterred. One particularly damning report revealed meetings between Andrew and several high-profile individuals whose reputations were equally tarnished. These meetings, originally claimed to be charitable discussions or diplomatic engagements, were actually centered around financial arrangements with no transparency and questionable legality. Andrew's own signature appeared on documents tied to foreign trusts and shell companies, complex structures designed to obscure the source and destination of large sums of money. What makes this scandal especially toxic isn't just the illegality, though that alone would have sufficed. It's the betrayal of trust. A royal is supposed to represent integrity, responsibility, and the embodiment of national pride. Andrew shattered all of that. And while the monarchy had the means to shield him for years, the world was changing. Public patience had evaporated. Social media amplified every misstep, news cycles devoured every leaked document, and the American lawsuits concerning Epstein provided relentless fodder for tabloids worldwide. Andrew, for his part, remained in denial. He continued to insist, in private and public statements, that the allegations were exaggerated or misunderstood. He surrounded himself with lawyers, PR experts, and old friends, hoping to create a wall of protection. But every attempt at damage control backfired. Each time he spoke, it seemed only to highlight the absurdity of his position. A prince, publicly denied access to charity functions and social engagements, defending himself in a world where the law was catching up and the cameras never blinked. And the irony was thick. Andrew's behavior, in some ways, echoed the arrogance of youth. Yet, it had long-lasting consequences. He was no longer a man whose mistakes could be quietly erased by palace discretion. He was a man facing criminal scrutiny, public shame, and now, exile. But the scandal didn't stop with Andrew. Sarah Ferguson, Fergie, as she was affectionately known in society circles, was weaving her own complicated story. While Andrew faced public condemnation, Fergie had her own issues quietly festering in the background. Investigators began digging into her charity dealings, uncovering patterns that suggested money had been misappropriated, donations redirected, and accounts falsified. She had always presented herself as charming, benevolent, and generous, the friendly ex, the woman who still loved her royal connections. But the truth told a darker tale, one of mismanagement, privilege, and a willingness to exploit her former position for personal gain. Sarah, in typical fashion, denied wrongdoing in public statements. Any discrepancies are clerical errors, she claimed. I've always acted with integrity. But evidence suggested otherwise. Records, emails, and witness statements painted a picture of deliberate maneuvering, and the public was starting to notice. Once the media realized there were two sides to the scandal, Andrew's misconduct and Sarah's financial irregularities, they began to connect the dots. It wasn't just one royal in crisis. It was an entire branch of the family in jeopardy. Meanwhile, the king observed it all silently. Charles had watched Andrew's pattern of arrogance, denial, and repeated mistakes, and Sarah's subtle manipulations and financial entanglements. It wasn't only about protecting the monarchy, it was about defending the very idea of the crown. He had to act decisively, not out of vengeance, but to prevent further damage. An act he did. Charles convened a confidential meeting with senior advisors, legal counsel, and palace strategists. He outlined what needed to be done. Andrew and Sarah would be removed from all royal duties, stripped of public titles, and their access to royal residences terminated. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a surgical strike to sever ties between the scandal and the crown. Yet, even as the plans were drafted, Andrew remained blissfully unaware. He was traveling between New York and London, giving interviews, shaking hands, attending private galas. In his mind, the worst-case scenario was a minor PR hiccup. He laughed at the press speculation. It's all noise, he told friends. Charles wouldn't do anything rash. But the king's patience had run out. The breaking point wasn't a single incident. It was the accumulation of years of negligence, arrogance, and poor judgment. Every misstep, every misused connection, every unchecked indulgence had built to this explosive moment. It was at that juncture that Charles decided to send the first formal warning. An envelope, marked confidential, hand-delivered to Andrew's residence. It instructed him to prepare for suspension from all royal duties and advised him to consult his legal team. The message was clear. The era of protection had ended. Andrew's reaction, predictably, was disbelief and rage. He contacted his lawyers immediately, demanding clarification. "You can't do this to me," he reportedly shouted. "I am still a member of this family. You can't just erase me." But Charles didn't respond. He let the order speak for itself. And within days, palace staff began quietly implementing the changes, security reassigned, access cards deactivated, and privileges revoked. The drama escalated further when Sarah Ferguson, oblivious to the magnitude of Andrew's impending exile, made plans for a media appearance to discuss her charitable work. She smiled for the cameras, laughing, joking, and presenting herself as the benign ex-duchess. But investigators had already flagged her accounts, tracing irregularities in donations and transfers, some linked directly to Andrew's ventures. It became clear that while Andrew was the public face of scandal, Sarah's mismanagement had enabled and compounded it. Even within the palace, staff were in shock. Courtiers who had served Andrew and Sarah loyally for decades suddenly faced uncertainty. Would they continue to serve their employers abroad? Would they be dismissed? Whispers of fear and speculation echoed through the corridors. As the week drew to a close, it became apparent that this scandal would not be contained. Public opinion had shifted. The press was relentless, the social media sphere ablaze with speculation, memes, and commentary. And for Andrew and Sarah, the realization of their vulnerability began to sink in. The scandal that never died had finally caught up to them. But just as it seemed the storm had reached its peak, a new, more dangerous twist emerged. Anonymous sources revealed the existence of previously undisclosed documents linking Andrew and Sarah Ferguson to foreign entities with possible legal implications in multiple countries. The potential international ramifications turned what had been a domestic scandal into a global investigation. And no one in the palace, not even the king himself, could predict what revelations those documents might unleash next. Because sometimes, when you think a scandal has reached its limit, that's exactly when it surprises you, and no one was ready for what was coming. Have you ever wondered how someone can smile while the walls are collapsing around them? That was Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, the friendly ex of British royalty. While the world fixated on Andrew, the headlines, the legal threats, the whispers of criminal misconduct, Sarah was quietly weaving a scandal of her own. And unlike Andrew, whose misdeeds were loud, messy, and public, Sarah's were subtle, hidden behind charm, charisma, and an almost hypnotic ability to deflect attention. It's easy to underestimate Sarah Ferguson. People see the laughter, the playful wave to photographers, the glossy magazine features, the charitable appearances. Fergie is harmless, they whisper. She's just the fun ex who keeps a connection to royalty alive. But the truth? Fergie was anything but harmless. She was a master at operating in the shadows, and for years, she had quietly built a network of financial entanglements that would now come crashing into view. While Andrew's mistakes were tabloid fodder, Sarah's actions had legal implications. Investigators began to uncover troubling patterns in her finances. Donations meant for charities redirected to offshore accounts, transactions linked to her personal ventures, and a series of shell companies that seemed to exist solely to obfuscate the movement of funds. Each discovery added another layer to the growing narrative. This was not incompetence or mismanagement. It was deliberate. Sarah's story had long been one of duality. To the public, she was charming, approachable, even slightly mischievous. To investigators, she was a figure operating with precision, fully aware of the consequences of her actions. The contrast was jarring. She had perfected the art of maintaining a public persona that was warm and relatable while conducting private dealings that were ethically questionable, if not outright illegal. Insiders reveal that Sarah had learned early on that the monarchy shields its own. She had seen her husband, Andrew, protected repeatedly despite increasingly reckless behavior. and she had seen the leniency extended to other royals, minor scandals brushed off with a nod and a polite smile. Sarah became adept at leveraging this system, operating under the assumption that proximity to power granted immunity. But this time, the system was breaking down. Charles had decided that the scandal could no longer be contained, and his focus had shifted to Sarah as much as Andrew. According to leaked palace memos, she had been quietly siphoning donations from her children's foundation into personal ventures. The auditors flagged multiple suspicious transactions, some traced to accounts in foreign jurisdictions, others disappearing into the digital ether without explanation. What made this scandal even more potent was the combination of her public persona and her private actions. Sarah Ferguson had always cultivated an image of generosity and benevolence. She appeared on television, smiling broadly, talking about empowering women, supporting education, and helping children in need. The public adored her, or at least many did. But each charitable smile now carried the weight of deception. The donations she claimed to honor were often diverted, sometimes partially, sometimes entirely, to projects that served her personal interests. And while Andrew was being scrutinized for entanglements with international figures and legal cases, Sarah's activities intersected with his in ways that made both of them vulnerable. Leaked communications showed that she had been coordinating certain transactions with Andrew, creating a tangled web of financial interactions that linked the couple inextricably. The palace realized that protecting one meant leaving the other exposed. And the choice, for Charles, was clear. The era of familial leniency was over. Yet Sarah remained outwardly calm. She continued her public appearances, laughing at gossip columns, posting photos of herself attending charity galas, and giving interviews that seemed perfectly poised to maintain her innocence. She projected confidence, but insiders note that this calm was carefully calculated. She knew the palace's inner workings, understood the optics, and relied on the hope that public perception could still be swayed in her favor. But the truth, as always, has a way of coming to light. Investigators pieced together a timeline showing coordinated transfers between Andrew's accounts and hers. They noted patterns that suggested the diversion of charitable funds had not been accidental. Multiple witnesses corroborated the existence of off-the-books dealings and private agreements meant to mask the flow of money. The public persona of a benevolent duchess clashed violently with the emerging evidence. Sarah's reaction to these revelations was telling. According to court reports and insider accounts, she initially denied wrongdoing, claiming clerical errors and miscommunications. "There's nothing to see here," she reportedly said during a private meeting with auditors. But as the investigators pressed, it became clear that the errors were too systematic, too consistent, and too well documented to be explained away. And here lies one of the most shocking contradictions in this scandal. While Andrew's missteps were brash, loud, and publicly humiliating, Sarah's were quiet, strategic, and potentially more damaging in the long term. The public may have focused on Andrew's flamboyant scandals, the international headlines, the lawsuits, the lurid photographs. But Sarah's calculated actions threatened the monarchy's finances, its credibility, and its moral authority. The palace, for its part, recognized the danger immediately. Charles understood that the monarchy could survive one scandal, Andrew's, but two simultaneous scandals, one involving moral misconduct and the other involving financial misconduct, posed an existential threat. The decision to act against Sarah was not personal, it was strategic. If the monarchy was to survive, both Andrew and Sarah had to be removed from positions of influence. Even with the exile order in place, Sarah's reach remained concerning. She had cultivated a network of friends in the media, social circles, and even in political circles who could amplify her narrative. The palace feared that if she publicly disclosed any details of Andrew's or her own dealings, it could spiral into a media storm that would further damage the crown. And yet, as investigators and advisors reminded Charles, inaction was no longer an option. The risk of exposure outweighed the risk of confrontation. The tension reached its peak when it was discovered that Sarah had made several late-night calls to international contacts just days before Andrew's exile. The content of these calls remains unconfirmed, but sources suggest they were attempts to mobilize resources or influence media narratives in her favor. This audacity, her calm yet defiant maneuvering while the monarchy acted against her husband, further illustrated why she was now considered a serious threat. One advisor summarized it bluntly. She's not the victim in this story. She's a partner. A silent partner. And silence is dangerous when it can be weaponized. Charles, in private, reportedly reflected on this. Andrew is loud. He makes mistakes everyone can see. But Sarah, she hides in plain sight. And hidden threats are the deadliest. As the palace prepared to formalize her removal and revoke her privileges, Sarah's public behavior remained untouched, carefully curated to maintain an image of innocence. But behind the scenes, the machinery of accountability was moving swiftly. Letters were drafted, legal teams consulted, and protocols established to ensure that both Andrew and Sarah would face the consequences of their intertwined scandals. Yet, even with all this preparation, there was an unpredictable element: Sarah Ferguson herself. Her unpredictability, charm, and ability to manipulate perception meant that every move by the palace could be countered with a strategic public appearance or subtle leak. She was a wild card, capable of undermining even the most carefully orchestrated plans. And so, as Andrew faced the exile order, Sarah remained a looming shadow. The public saw only the smiling Duchess attending events, but inside Buckingham Palace, the king and his advisors understood the full extent of the threat she posed. Every financial discrepancy, every secret meeting, every hidden transaction had the potential to ignite a new scandal, one that could eclipse Andrew's exile and shake the monarchy to its core. But then came the most shocking revelation yet. During a routine audit of her foundation, investigators discovered documents linking Sarah to transactions involving foreign trusts and entities previously associated with Andrew's legal entanglements. These weren't minor mistakes. They suggested deliberate coordination and strategic planning to channel funds in ways that were opaque, potentially illegal, and damaging to the crown. The implications were staggering. If exposed, these connections could not only ruin Sarah's reputation, but also implicate Andrew in a broader network of financial impropriety. And for King Charles, the realization hit hard. The exile of Andrew was just the beginning. Sarah Ferguson's silent partnership in the scandal meant that the monarchy's troubles were far from over. And as the palace prepared the final steps of her removal, letters drafted, privileges revoked, and media narratives controlled, Sarah Ferguson herself was reportedly planning her next move. A move that could either save her reputation or drag the monarchy deeper into crisis. Because one thing was certain: while Andrew was loud, Sarah was clever. And clever people always leave a trail of surprises behind them. The palace thought they had contained the scandal. They thought the exile order would end the story. But the reality was much darker. Sarah Ferguson was still in play, and what she did next would shock even the most seasoned palace insiders. What happens when a king must decide between family and duty? When blood conflicts with the crown, the choices aren't easy, and the consequences can be catastrophic. King Charles faced that very dilemma, and the only way to navigate it was to gather a hidden council of advisors, legal experts, and trusted allies. Behind the gilded doors of Clarence House, decisions were being made that would change the fate of the House of York forever. The council wasn't public. It wasn't televised. It wasn't even widely known among palace staff. Only the most senior courtiers, a few legal advisors, and a handful of loyal aides were present. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, the kind of tension that feels like electricity before a storm strikes. Charles began the meeting with a short, deliberate statement. We have reached a point where discretion is no longer sufficient. The scandals of the Duke and Duchess of York are no longer minor infractions. They are a threat to the monarchy itself. No one spoke immediately. Silence carried more weight than words in that room. Finally, the Lord Chamberlain, a seasoned advisor who had served the royal family for decades, leaned forward. Your Majesty, the public is already aware of Andrew's legal troubles. The media speculation on Sarah's finances is growing. We must act decisively to protect the crown. Charles nodded. Decisive action, yes, but measured. I will not act out of vengeance. The monarchy must remain above scandal, even as it addresses it directly. The king's private secretary presented the first reports, meticulously detailing Andrew's alleged misconduct, the potential criminal charges, and the evidence regarding Sarah's financial dealings. Legal counsel outlined the implications of inaction, emphasizing that continued association with Andrew and Sarah could implicate the monarchy in negligence or complicity. The room grew colder as advisors exchanged glances. Every advisor knew the stakes. Delay or error could unravel the very institution they had sworn to protect. And yet, the solution they were contemplating was unprecedented. In the modern era of the British monarchy, no reigning king had ever exiled a close family member. The implications were enormous, both domestically and internationally. Then Charles spoke, voice low but commanding. "I need options. Complete, thorough, and enforceable. I need to know how we can remove them from public life, from royal estates, and from any influence over the monarchy without creating a spectacle that damages us further." The chief legal advisor responded, "Your Majesty, there are 3 paths. 1. Quietly strip them of their patronages and hope they comply. 2. Remove financial support and cut off access to properties and privileges. 3. Exile. Require them to reside outside the UK." Charles considered the options carefully. Option 1 risks non-compliance. Option 2 risks defiance. Option 3 is severe, but it is final. It is the only choice that ensures the monarchy's integrity. An audible gasp echoed in the room. Exile, something that felt more like a medieval punishment than a contemporary measure, was being seriously considered. The advisors understood the magnitude of the decision. No precedent existed in modern Britain for this level of royal discipline. The Lord Chamberlain broke the silence. "Your Majesty, if I may, exile will shock the public. Andrew is a well-known figure. Sarah is popular with certain circles. There will be backlash, media scrutiny, public outrage." Charles's eyes narrowed. The backlash is inevitable, yes. But inaction would be worse. If we allow them to continue unchecked, the monarchy itself is at risk. One more misstep, one more scandal, and the damage will be irreparable. The king's private secretary, always precise, interjected, "Your Majesty, the mechanics of exile are complex. It will involve coordination with the Home Office, security reassignment, and international compliance if they relocate abroad. There are legal ramifications we must prepare for." Charles leaned back in his chair. He had faced complex problems before, constitutional dilemmas, public opinion crises, but this was different. This was personal. His own brother, his former sister-in-law, people who had once been at the heart of his family's social life, now represented threats that could undermine the monarchy's credibility and stability. Yet even as the plan began to take shape, Charles knew there were human consequences. Exile was not merely a legal maneuver. It was a familial rupture. The personal fallout would be severe. Andrew would feel betrayed. Sarah would feel humiliated. And both would likely lash out, leveraging public perception to cast themselves as victims. The king had to weigh these consequences against the survival of the crown. Discussions turned to logistics. The council debated how to deliver the exile order, how to coordinate security measures, and how to manage potential legal challenges. Each detail was dissected, every scenario considered. They prepared for the possibility of media leaks, international attention, and public protests. Nothing was left to chance. As the meeting continued, Charles reflected on the irony. His mother, Queen Elizabeth, had shielded Andrew for decades, maintaining the illusion of stability while covering up numerous indiscretions. But Elizabeth was gone. Her protective influence had vanished, leaving Charles to confront the raw reality of his family's misconduct. He also knew the public's perception mattered deeply. If the monarchy was seen as complicit or passive, its moral authority would erode. Yet if the king acted too aggressively, he risked alienating the very subjects he sought to protect. Balancing justice, perception, and family loyalty required precision, and Charles was determined to achieve it. By the end of the meeting, a consensus emerged. Andrew and Sarah would be removed from their public roles, stripped of privileges, and instructed to reside abroad. Security details would be reassigned. Financial arrangements tied to royal resources would be terminated, and a carefully worded statement would be prepared to preempt media speculation, emphasizing that these measures were taken to protect the monarchy, not as acts of vengeance. But even with a plan in place, Charles sensed the uncertainty. Exile was one thing. Controlling the narrative was another. Sarah Ferguson, with her charisma and media connections, could turn the story in unpredictable ways. Andrew's stubbornness could provoke confrontation. The palace's inner circle knew that executing the plan would require coordination, discipline, and an almost surgical precision in managing public perception. Charles also understood that this hidden council was his safety net. Advisors, legal counsel, and loyal aides were essential to navigating the storm. Without their guidance, the risk of mistakes and scandal would be magnified exponentially. Each advisor knew the stakes. A misstep could cost the monarchy credibility, trust, and stability in the eyes of the public. As the council adjourned, Charles lingered in the room, staring out at the night over London. The city below was oblivious to the upheaval within Clarence House. The lights shimmered across the Thames, the streets bustling with life, while inside, decisions were being made that would change the course of British royalty forever. He turned to his private secretary. "Prepare the final documents. We move at first light." And with that, the hidden council dissolved, leaving only the king to contemplate the gravity of his decision. Exile had never been attempted in modern times. He was about to make history. But history, as he knew, rarely unfolds without consequences. Someone inside the palace, it seemed, had already anticipated the king's next move. Documents were being copied. Emails were being archived. Leaks were prepared for release at the opportune moment. The palace's careful strategy was already at risk. Charles realized, perhaps too late, that while he had convened the hidden council to protect the crown, there were forces at work even within his own walls that could undermine everything. And in that quiet, tense moment, the king knew the truth. Removing Andrew and Sarah from public life would not be the end of the scandal. It would only mark the beginning of an even more dangerous chapter. Because when you confront betrayal, secrecy, and ambition in a family like the royals, the consequences are never fully predictable. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever realized that some secrets refuse to stay buried? That no matter how carefully you hide them, the past has a way of clawing its way back to the surface? That's exactly what happened with Prince Andrew. The initial police letters and media speculation were only the opening act. The real storm was about to hit, and it came in the form of a deep, unrelenting investigation that threatened to unravel everything Andrew and Sarah had built. It started quietly. Scotland Yard began reviewing old case files, cross-referencing witness statements, and examining financial documents that had been collected over the years. But this was different. Unlike prior investigations, this one was thorough, relentless, and uncompromising. Investigators were no longer content with surface-level interviews or polite dismissals. Every lead was pursued, every anomaly scrutinized. Andrew's network of associates, old business ventures, and charitable engagements were all brought under the microscope. At first, Andrew assumed it was just another round of bureaucratic noise, another attempt to intimidate him, like previous scandals that had blown over. He carried on with his routine, attending events, maintaining his public persona, brushing off the press, and smiling for photographs. But behind the cameras, investigators were piecing together a narrative he could not control. And then the first shock came: new witness statements. Individuals who had previously remained silent were suddenly providing detailed accounts of Andrew's interactions with high-profile figures connected to financial misconduct and dubious international dealings. Some accounts referenced meetings abroad, offshore accounts, and unexplained transfers of money. Others hinted at attempts to manipulate or intimidate witnesses who could provide evidence against him. The implications were staggering. Andrew had been under scrutiny for years, but the new evidence painted him not as a careless or naive royal, but as a deliberate participant in activities that could constitute serious legal violations. His denial and arrogance no longer mattered. The case was solidifying, and the net was tightening around him. Even more concerning for the palace were the connections to Sarah Ferguson. The investigation revealed that many of the suspicious transactions, previously attributed solely to Andrew's mismanagement, were coordinated with Sarah. She had been more than a bystander. She was actively involved in financial dealings that now risked implicating both of them. Emails, spreadsheets, and bank statements demonstrated an intricate web of shared interests, all meticulously hidden behind the veneer of charitable work and social appearances. At Clarence House, King Charles and his advisors watched these developments with mounting concern. They knew that the longer Andrew and Sarah remained in the public eye, the greater the threat to the monarchy's reputation. The investigation wasn't just about uncovering past mistakes. It was about preventing future damage. Every revelation, every corroborated detail, increased the urgency of decisive action. Meanwhile, Andrew's own behavior became increasingly erratic. He began contacting former aides, lawyers, and even journalists in a desperate attempt to control the narrative. "I'm being set up," he reportedly said in one recorded call. "This is political. They're trying to ruin me." His tone, a mix of fear and defiance, revealed a man realizing that protection from the monarchy had limits, and that those limits were being tested. Sarah, for her part, continued her public charm offensive. She appeared on television, smiled for photographs, and engaged in interviews portraying herself as the innocent ex-duchess caught in a whirlwind of circumstance. But investigators weren't fooled. They recognized the pattern: diversion, deflection, and manipulation. Her calculated public persona was designed to maintain influence and sway public perception, even as the legal net closed around her and Andrew. And the deeper the investigation went, the more dangerous it became for both of them. Analysts noted that financial trails leading through foreign trusts and shell companies were becoming increasingly difficult to disentangle. Connections to international figures, previously dismissed as inconsequential, were now under serious scrutiny. Every bank transfer, every meeting, every signature became evidence in a growing narrative of coordinated misconduct. What made matters even more dramatic was the internal conflict within the palace. Advisors knew that Andrew and Sarah's exposure could not only tarnish the monarchy, but also expose vulnerabilities in Charles's leadership. The king's own judgment was under review. Was he too lenient? Too harsh? Could the monarchy survive the fallout without significant damage? Every decision carried weight far beyond Andrew and Sarah. They affected public confidence, political stability, and the legacy of the crown. Public attention was relentless. The media, having caught wind of new investigative leads, began publishing articles speculating on the potential criminal charges Andrew could face. Headlines screamed about royal corruption, ex-officer exposed, and the Duke under investigation again. Social media amplified every leak, every rumor, and every new detail. For Andrew and Sarah, the world was closing in, and exile suddenly felt more like a temporary measure than a solution. Inside Buckingham Palace, discussions turned to contingency planning. Legal teams drafted documents outlining potential charges, court proceedings, and international ramifications. Advisors debated strategies for mitigating media fallout and maintaining public trust in the monarchy. The exile order, once a dramatic gesture, now became a strategic necessity to protect the institution itself. Yet, even with meticulous planning, there was an unpredictable variable: Andrew and Sarah's reaction. Their ability to manipulate, charm, and provoke was well known. Advisors feared that public outbursts or calculated leaks could destabilize the carefully constructed narrative. One misstep, one unguarded comment, could undo weeks of preparation and reignite a scandal of unprecedented proportions. The investigators pressed on, following financial trails that spanned continents. Offshore accounts, international trusts, and complex corporate structures revealed a network of transactions previously unseen. The deeper they delved, the clearer it became that Andrew and Sarah had been operating not as isolated figures, but as participants in a larger, more intricate system of influence and finance. The stakes were no longer confined to the UK. They had become international. And as evidence mounted, the palace prepared for the inevitable: Andrew's public fall from grace. Legal counsel worked to coordinate with government authorities, media teams strategized messaging, and Charles prepared to enforce the exile order with precision. Every move had to be calculated, every detail scrutinized. The monarchy's credibility was on the line. But just when it seemed the investigation had reached its peak, a new revelation emerged. Hidden in the layers of financial documents was a connection neither Andrew nor Sarah had anticipated. Correspondence suggesting collusion with individuals outside the immediate royal circle, people with political and business influence across Europe and North America. The implication was clear: this was no longer a scandal confined to family mismanagement or misjudgment. It had the potential to become a global incident, with consequences reaching far beyond Buckingham Palace. The palace recognized the urgency. Immediate steps were taken to secure sensitive documents, restrict access to communications, and monitor potential leaks. Security teams were doubled. Legal advisors worked around the clock. Charles himself was more involved than ever, personally overseeing every stage of the investigation.